I don't have any slides because, well, basically I didn't want to bore you with slides. And I was hoping that we could talk. What I really want to do is inspire all of the people in this room to use their talents to make the world a better place. So I want to start off with a little motivational guilt that my father used to give me. When I was a little kid, he would say, when the next Holocaust comes, it will be your fault for not having stopped it. And that Jewish guilt continued through my entire youth, and I hope that I can share that with you. I think I said something similar last year, but it will be your fault if you do not work to stop it. And the way that you stop that is by working to achieve positive goals, not merely by resisting, but by building alternatives so that people have alternatives to actually use. Just as I think we were discussing with these tools, it's important to think about it in a systemic sense. So first, I want to thank Dan and Tanya for making this talk possible, since they constantly try to drag me to the Netherlands. And then I want to basically talk a little bit about some grounding facts. Now, I think I can't really improve on Addy's talk, actually, though he was mostly talking about the reporting that Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, myself, Christian Grothoff, and other people have done with the Snowden documents. I think his overview is very good, and I think that if you ever have someone who wants to know the sort of big picture, that's a good start to it. But I want to talk about what some of it means. And maybe I guess I'll disclose some things that aren't public yet, because I feel like that'll help piece together some things that will scare the hell out of the rest of you, and that's a useful motivator sometimes. So first of all, I have a theory of power with regard to surveillance, and I think it's a reasonable theory of power, and it's something like a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid is you, as a human being, as an individual outside of your nation state, and at the top of the pyramid, you can think of it as the all-seeing eye from the American dollar bill. That's the NSA. Below that, you have the GCHQ. Below that, you have, for example, the Canadians, the Australians, and then you sort of get down to lower-ranking intelligence communities. I mean, I think the Israelis are near the top, and there's these inner relationships, and the Russians are a little bit lower than that, and the Chinese are somewhere below that, and, you know, Ecuador is much lower than that, and the Brazilians are somewhere else, and it's not really clear. And this pyramid is scary to me and is concerning to me precisely because it's not actually fixed. It's not a static thing. And so when we design a world that fundamentally is unequal, that favors people at the top of the pyramid, at the expense of all of us at the bottom of the pyramid, it comes from this assumption that the pyramid is static. And that is really dangerous. So when we build backdoors into systems, we're actually dealing with a system where the people that run it may change. So that might flip. So when we think about it in terms of human justice or in terms of technology, we can see that there are these power relationships which are very dynamic. And I think that this in itself is a very concerning reality. Now, there are a lot of ways to look at all of this, but if you look at all of the things that Addy discussed, all the things that have been disclosed, you see that fundamentally they're about asymmetric power, and specifically about power of information, and information that can be used for specific ends, be them economic or political. In some cases, it's religious. In other cases, it's something totally obscure. It might be just a little bureaucrat trying to win a particular debate with someone where they task people for surveillance. But fundamentally, it's about power. And what that says to me is that we have to think about it in terms of power. So what is the greatest power that no one discusses at the moment? And that is analytics. And that is the thing that we are just in the beginning of. So all of the surveillance that we see, we aren't talking about the analytics. But one of the things we'll see in the next 5 and 10 years is pattern of life analysis. They already do this. There are people that are experts in pattern of life. And people like Merkel, when she was tasked for surveillance, what she's actually a part of is a thing we could call whole life monitoring. We can't talk about it in terms of wiretapping. That doesn't even, it doesn't even begin to represent the informational capacity of this kind of tasking. Rather, what it is that everything she does, everything she touches, has a unique identifier, effectively. And her voice itself can be represented as a series of unique identifiers, her voice pattern. And everything that is going on with those unique identifiers will be taken from these massive intake systems and then selected, stored, and potentially analyzed in some way. And when that analysis happens, we don't know exactly how it will happen in the future. But right now, one of the ways that it happens is people have behavioral analytics programs to determine if you're a terrorist. For example, this is what signature strikes in the Middle East are. The idea is not, as some people originally thought, the signature of the president to sign off on an assassination, but rather the signature of your daily behavior. And from that, those traits about your basic life, they actually teach the machines about your alleged intentions. So effectively, your data doppelganger is you. And effectively, the surveillance is power over you. And in fact, it's more important than you. And that is a very, 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 very seriously different way of looking at the world, because you are your quantified self in that case. So what is this surveillance? The surveillance is ultimately about you, wiring into you and over you. And it's incredible when we think about how this might work. In China, for example, basically in the next, I'd say, 15 years, we're going to see a convergence of a lot of American corporate spying and the way that they deal with all of the surveillance of all of us on the internet, and the way that society in general is run. So the Chinese are working on a credit system, essentially, and I think it's really kind of hilarious, but not in a funny ha-ha way, but funny, oh, the irony of how similar it is to the way that corporations do data profiling and the way that governments do data profiling, and merging them together. So in China, you'll have to have the correct credit score to get the right job. They don't call it a credit score, they call it something else. And Chinese bureaucrats who talk about it say that since we don't have morality of our groups anymore and of our society, we have to have systems that control us. And the thing that is the most amusing to me, in a sense, is how similar that looks to the dragnet surveillance that Western nations propose and the analytics programs that Western nations propose. There really are not huge differences, and in fact, Cisco is one of the primary enablers of the Chinese system. So in fact, these systems feed each other. And the similarities between that networked authoritarianism is particularly troubling because in the West, we tend to think of this as a problem of over-theristan. But these analytics programs are really going to impact all of us, and they will impact us over a long period of time. For example, Chinese actors breaking into medical companies in the United States to figure out who real people are. Because if you want to do counterintelligence, you need to understand who the people are, and if you have a list of fake names, of course, you can check to see if they're fake by looking to see all the real data that you have. It's very economically expensive to create that data, to create historical data, and to create fake personalities. So these analytical phases are really fascinating. So if you want to have privacy in the future, one of the things you'll need to do soon is create fake identities now and populate them with data today. And if you don't do that, in the future, you won't be able to switch identities when you want to do something that you want to have unlinked. So get started now is one interesting takeaway I would suggest. But one of the things that I think I'd like to focus on for the next few minutes is this notion of selector-based surveillance. I want to sort of get an idea. Who understands the idea of a selector? Could you raise your hand? Okay. Who has no idea what I'm talking about? And the difference between those two groups is the not participating set, I guess. So I think probably the easiest way to say it is raise your hand if you have a phone number, keep your hand up, or raise it again if you have an email address. Great. So this impacts everybody that raised their hand, and that's basically everyone in the room. So those are selectors. A selector is a unique identifier that, when fed into a surveillance system, allows someone to select, as it were, content that is flowing through that system. So you have individual parcels of information, let's say. One selector might be that you're a Muslim, or that you're a Jew. Another selector might be that you're straight, or that you're gay, or that you're white, or that you have more than 10,000 euros in the bank account. Depending on the kind of surveillance system, this is a discriminating factor that allows someone to take a look at some piece of information and then to separate it from the rest of the information. So selector-based surveillance is what all of the nations of Europe right now are discussing doing. They want to do dragnet surveillance, and from the dragnet, they want to seize everything that they possibly can and then feed it into a system, usually called X-keyscore. That's the NSA's version of the Chinese deep packet inspection system. And they want to then feed these selectors in, and then pull that data in, and then do analytics on it. So that kind of selector-based surveillance is a full flip from the way that we have previously done surveillance, which is to do targeting of very specific people, and then maybe to take the full content of everything that they actually have, or that they are able to see from that person. So that's a really scary thing, but it's not just so much scary as it is causing us to reflect on the way that we build security systems and to think of time as a different kind of factor. And so cryptographers that are in this room right now, I think there are a few, we have to think about this differently when we talk with cryptographers. Because time is, in fact, one of the most important things. that is working against us. Now, Adi said in his talk, this data center in Utah, I know that there are at least 3 data centers like that. And those are called massive data repositories. MDR 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that I've heard about. The one in Utah, I've heard now it's called Mission Data Repository because the word massive brings about some sort of scary feelings in some people. So they wanted to go for a rebranding, the same acronym, which is hilarious. But these people are planning to store data for 100 years. So that means your cryptography that you use today, or that you didn't use today because you arrogantly believed, like that guy's father, that you wouldn't need any crypto, that you have nothing to hide, right? But is that true for 100 years? I mean, I don't know about everyone in the audience, but at least for myself, I can't predict 10 years in the future what I'm going to be doing really accurately to the minute. So can I really be sure of that? Can I really understand what the impact of a particular choice will be? Especially in places where there's a lot of flux, that's very concerning to me. So it makes us think about this in a very long-term way. And there's a group called the Long Now Foundation in San Francisco where they try to encourage people to have long-term thinking. So they're building a clock that will run for 10,000 years. It's very interesting. It autocorrects with the sun through a time cam. So the idea is that even if there are no people around, the machine can autocorrect itself to run accurately. It also has a nice solar system, so you can see the positions of the planets and so on. They also encourage people to write the year with the 0 in front of it. So we're in year 0, 2015. And the idea there is really to encourage people to think long-term. We need a similar exercise in security studies, I think, and privacy and autonomy studies, if you will. Because we need to think about the fact that there are adversaries that are, in fact, recording every cryptographic handshake that happens on the internet, putting them in a massive data repository, and then doing cryptanalytic attacks on those handshakes. We don't know what those are. But if you had that data set, what could you do? Who's even exploring those kinds of spaces? Right now, mostly it is attackers, and they care not at all about the law. So if we have a 100-year crypto problem, I think it's important to tackle it. There's a guy named Zuko who is, in fact, working on this 100-year crypto program, and I think it's an interesting research direction. And I would really encourage actually looking into it, trying to imagine if we get sci-fi computers, that is quantum computers, if we have these nice sci-fi computers, what will that do to all of our crypto? How will that work? Does that mean that we need to now make sure that all of our cryptography is in fact resistant to these science fiction computers? Are they in fact science fiction? As far as we know from the Snowden documents, they are still science fiction computers. They're not actually something that you can use today to break the classical cryptography that we're using. But will that always be true? And since attacks always get better, if you have a massive data set of all the selected content on the internet, can you do end-to-end correlation? Probably. We don't have evidence of them doing that, really at scale. We're doing de-anonymization. But of course, if someone simply sits down with that data set, it becomes a math problem. And it becomes probably a very easily tractable math problem for someone with that data set. And it's previously only a theoretical problem that isn't really even interesting because academically it's probably even solved. It's something that wasn't secure in the first place by many people's estimations. So there are a few things that I would like to encourage people to do in the room because when I was asked to give this talk, I was supposed to tell you about things that I thought that were technically interesting or important to do, and sort of encouraging people to engineer some solutions. But I should say that as a basis, I think that all of these technical solutions or technical ideas fall fundamentally inside of the idea that we have to have a liberal democracy with human rights. So following up with what Menzo has said, we have to have that. And I think, therefore, it cannot be that we talk to our politicians badly, let's say about their lack of technology. I think we have to work to fix that. Once they understand these things, they're going to actually make different power decisions. Some of the politicians are definitely going to be in favor of mass surveillance because it does increase their power. And that is an important thing to understand. It is not because they don't understand surveillance. It is precisely because they understand surveillance. Hillary Clinton hosting her own emails is not because she's very technical necessarily, but it is because she understands the power relationship that her email has over her, and what you would be able to do with it, or what I, as an American citizen, would. So we have to recognize that, and then we have to draw out those things politically. And I think one way to do that is to get people in government to fund academic research and free software development. And when we have that, when people actually work towards doing that, we'll actually be able to understand where their power politics lies. We'll be able, in fact, to know if they want to enable every single person to be able to securely communicate with journalists or not. If they want to be able to make sure that we have integrity in our infrastructure or not. It actually becomes a question of how they actually allocate resources. And I think that if we're going to have states, and clearly we do, and in Europe they tend to be a little bit better than other places, it seems like that would be a very useful thing to try to do, to work within that system. And that's a very reformist thing to say, and I think it's a reasonable thing to say. But I would, because I said it. But I would suggest the following things. A new human right is the first thing. And that is the right to be unpredictable. That is, I have a right to entropy, to be entropy. And I think that this is a very strange thing, and it will take a lot of work, but I expect by the time that I'm Adi's age, if I live that long, it will be the case that, and I meant that in a nice way, it was a hopeful thing for me, I think being entropic is fundamentally a thing which is what liberal democracies come from. That is, the right to be unpredictable, really, in the sense that in a world of data analytics where your behavior is modeled, abnormal behavior, that is behavior that is unpredictable by a machine that has been surveilling you, you become a statistical outlier. You become a problem by merely having free will. And we must ensure that this is not the case. That should be a hallmark of a free society, that we are allowed to be entropic, where people cannot predict the things that we are going to do, and that that is okay. If we lose that, I think we lose the rest of it. Because, in fact, all the cryptography in the world falls apart without entropy. And I think free societies fall apart without entropy as well. And I think maybe there's too much of a stretch in my analogy, but not too much, maybe not too much of a stretch in that analogy. So the right to be entropic is important. I mean, all the cryptography in the world, I think, won't actually free people. In fact, all the cryptography in the world can lock us into systems that are fundamentally very tyrannical in nature. And I've said it many times before, but I want to say it again because specifically it applies in Holland. The first big data project of Europe was the Holocaust, and it was enabled by IBM. So when IBM builds smart cities, you just have to remember, they're not necessarily good cities. We have to actually program that into those systems, and we have to be aware of the fact that the cities can be turned against us, and not just by the Chinese, but by each other. Those systems are things that we can reprogram. If we lived in an actually free, egalitarian society where people were equal, I think we could have a different discussion, but we're not there. For example, when a woman in the audience said earlier that she didn't think that people needed to know where she was, what I wanted to say is, if I were a woman alive today, I would also have some fear about people knowing my location. Because at the core of it, that is part of the problem. There are asymmetric power relationships. So again, the surveillance is harmful, but not necessarily in obvious ways, or it is an obvious thing, but only for some people. So to that end, we should look at standardization bodies, and I think this is a good master's project, and Ruben, are you in the room? You are. Could you stand up? So Ruben offered, this is Ruben, everybody, he offered, I think, to work with some students on this if they're interested, but if we look at all of the IATF standards that are around, we see that some of the standards actually standardize putting in random bytes into the protocol, but not random bytes, for example, that have been run through a hash function, but rather random bytes that reveal the state of your RNG. And one of the things that we've seen in the Snowden documents is that exactly those random bytes can be fed into a process that reconstructs the state of the RNG that allows you to decrypt, for example, a session, because it allows you to step backwards in time and understand the values that are in a Diffie-Hellman handshake between two people, for example. Those standards are out there. Now we know that that's one of the back doors. You could just go through every single RFC and find them, figure out who the author was, and now you know who the bad actors potentially are, and in addition, you know which RFCs need to be updated. So you not only found the bad actors, and you can ask them, why is it that you backdoored our crypto? Or why are you so poorly designing this? Your choice of words. But you can also fix it. Now, I think it's important to come up with an actual secure construction. I think that it's probably not sufficient to just take random bytes and to hash them, because there's all sorts of issues with truncation, and it depends on the size of the field and so on. But we need to come up with some ultimate solution to that, or a reasonable solution to it, so that we can fix that. This is a problem with TLS right now, right? The TLS protocol, the SSL protocol, it has this. And it's specified. And it's not so different than other cryptographic backdoors, I think. So whether or not that's a backdoor, it's a point of debate. It's very clearly a weakness, which we can fix, and we should. For example, with DSA, we know that one of the parameters, when poorly chosen and not deterministically chosen, that is also something. You can see these kinds of things in the standards. And Ruben, I think, is interested in finding students here at Eindhoven that would like to work on that, and I will assist with that project if he wants my help, because I think it's a great idea, and it will actually concretely make the spies who are using that go dark a little bit, and anything that makes their day a little harder is something that brings me deep joy in my heart. So if you are interested in working on something like that, I would really encourage you to do it. To that end, there's another really rich field in standards which would be useful, and that is removing distinguishers from protocols, because selector-based surveillance requires differences. And when there is a difference, or when there's any uniquely identifying thing, that uniquely identifying thing is used to separate out the wheat from the chaff, essentially. But maybe it would be useful to change that, right? So there are protocols and there are ways of doing cryptographic constructions that make it very difficult to do selector-based surveillance. So for example, Alligator is one of the things that makes it a little bit more difficult for people to find specific things on the wire. That's a useful thing. We should look at these protocols and actually try to construct them in such a way that it becomes more difficult for mass surveillance rather than less difficult. And in terms of physical security, Adi also mentioned, and I kind of feel scooped by Adi, by my own work being scooped by Adi, but about interdiction. And this is the thing, like I used to shop on the internet, and I mean, I use prepaid credit cards, and I'd mail it to like a mail drop, and I'd do a lot of stuff to make sure that everything was fine. But I was always concerned that mail interdiction was a real problem. And especially in the work that I've done as a journalist, I wanted to be very sure that the equipment that I had hadn't been tampered with. And so for a very long time, I asked hardware manufacturers to give me x-rays of the boards, as well as specific specifications, the weight of the board, and a dump of the firmware. Now, I know that not every journalist does that, but you know, there's a survival advantage to knowing how technology works, and if you're on the other end of the spectrum, it doesn't go very well. So it turns out that that's just like not a solved problem. It's not even trivial to dump the firmware on devices, and even if you can dump it, it doesn't mean you can reflash it, and it doesn't mean that if you can dump it that you even got the device to give you the real firmware, so it's a really hard problem. But at least if, for example, you have a piece of hardware and a totally different piece of hardware shows up, just doing a visual inspection on the x-ray, with an x-ray, you just get out your portable x-ray machine, you x-ray the board you received, and then you compare the images. You see how hard this problem is? Exactly. What we need, and again, this is a thing that I think that needs to be created, and it's a really great thing for an academic place to host, is a collection of boards, where we just x-ray boards. So you spend the money from an academic grant on buying an x-ray machine, and x-ray every computer that you possibly can, and put these images inside of an open database where anyone can download it. And you leave it as an exercise to the reader, of course, whether or not they have done an x-ray properly on their side. But then you can have comparisons, and you can have people submit. And now you have a cool computer vision problem also. Are these boards the same? And companies can then sign, for example, the boards that they want people to think are theirs. So for example, the USB Armory, they recently sent me a mail saying, hey, just to let you know, we shipped you this board that you bought, and I know you're really interested in it. We have an x-ray of that board also. And so some people are starting to do it, but one vendor doing it does not a toolkit make. And so we need to do that. That still doesn't tell us if there's this stealthy dopant Trojan, for example, like making the hardware behave differently. But it starts to work towards at least getting rid of any low-rent attacker who would do something like flip out one chip for another. That's not really that low rent of an attacker, but you know, it's less so than some, I suppose. So I think building this X-ray database, shared under a free license, under the Creative Commons probably, that's easily a couple master's thesis worth of work. But whoever does that is really going to be solving a hard problem that we need to solve. It's fundamentally part of a supply chain problem, which is fundamentally not a military problem, as people like to frame it, but it's actually a free society problem, because everyone in society uses computers. And it is just the case that we're heavily reliant on them. And when we let the military-industrial complex frame these problems, it's always a security problem and never a liberty problem. It's never a human rights problem. It's always this power problem where power is delegated to people in the military. So if we solve these things with civic institutions, we actually cut the military just out of the picture entirely, which for the things where it's okay to do that, it will work in those spaces. And for the things where it's not, they'll take them back. I promise you about that. So that physical security thing is something which I think is great. I'd love to work on it with anyone that wants to give me an X-ray machine. Or if you have one here, we can X-ray my hardware as a starting point. I stopped buying stuff on the internet because I didn't have access to an X-ray anymore. So maybe there are other people like that. There's some interesting tricks you can also do with that. For example, mailing yourself packages that have tracking devices in them. I think this is also a fun academic project. I recommend that you mail a package to Julian Assange if you want to test this. There are many other people around the world, if you mail them packages and you mail their neighbor a similar package, the mail takes a different path. Why is that? I think it would be an interesting paper to look at that from a systemic perspective. Why does mail route differently? And how does mail route differently? Just as a systems question. It's a black box, so you can do a black box analysis. So in a very specific free software thing, I think we actually need to find people who are good at auditing. And this is a very difficult thing to do in general because most people, I think, are not interested in finding bugs in software. Some people are, but it's very specialized, and it's very difficult to be really good at it. And there are a few people in the world, I would say in the order of hundreds or thousands of people that are really, really good at it. And we really need, basically, for people to become extremely good programmers to focus on auditing software, to check the work of the other people that think they're really good programmers. And there are a lot of them. But for example, for every Christian Gruthoff who's writing in GNU-net, there isn't the equivalent version of him auditing his own software. And he can't do it himself, especially if he were dishonest, which he is not, I believe. So I think there are some very specific things that also need to happen. For example, most applications and most trusted computing bases do not work with Tor by default. We can get it to work, we can sort of wedge it in together, but it doesn't actually, by default, you can't buy an iPhone and have it come with Tor. Now, I have a big critique of all of the iThing devices, and I have some questions about having smartphones, but for everybody that has a smartphone, it should be the case that that option is there for them. It will improve the situation, even though it does not solve all of the systemic issues. So people that have Android devices, they can do this, but of course Google doesn't ship it by default. We need to actually fix that. For a while, the Chrome OS actually did ship with Tor by default, installed on every Chrome OS book, which was neat. It was there for a little bit, and then it was gone. And the main reason is because they couldn't solve, they said, the user interface issues. How do you explain to someone what anonymity means? So we need human research to actually understand what that means. But we also need to convince all of the companies of the world that it's in their benefit, just as the same way that we're working with civil society to convince them of that. Civil society, now that they are victimized by mass surveillance, tends to get that. Corporations haven't really, in some cases, they haven't felt it, especially new ones in Silicon Valley. They don't always get it. Or in some cases, they perpetrate it, so it doesn't serve them to actually work to stop it. And of course, some states, they are schizophrenic. Most states are schizophrenic, so of course, they use it at the same time as demonizing it, because they're happy to build another one or to destroy that one. So the Tor browser is a specification as well as a piece of software. And the Tor browser specification is something that we could improve in the sense that we can make a real privacy by design kind of web browser. And it doesn't need to be done by Mike Perry from the Tor project. Although he's very good at these things, we should actually be working, if anyone here is working on web browsers, trying to make something that is as private as the Tor browser is, but a completely different rendering engine with completely different platform assumptions. And if we do that, we need to think about how we would distribute it. So there's this classic trusting trust paper. Raise your hand if you have heard of it. Okay, to recap that, which is a little shocking, I'm glad to see there are more Tor users probably in the room than the people that know that paper, but now we're going to tell you why it's not such a big deal, and then why it's a horrible, horrible nightmare at the same time. In trusting trust, you essentially, to boil it down, if you have a compiler and you want to compile a piece of software, you have this nice little problem. How do you know what your compiler is going to produce? Anybody? You're going to read the source code for your compiler, perhaps? And how will you compile that source code? Right, so you have a little bit of a conundrum. So we have a similar conundrum in the free software world. It's not the greatest trusting trust example, but hopefully Ken Thompson will come and talk about that here someday. Let's say you audit the free software of the Tor browser. How do you know that the binary that we produce on our website is the same one as the source code that you have just read? So you've invested thousands of hours of time and you've done a university study of that. What has happened? Well, when you compile it and when we compile it, we've done a lot of work with, at the Tor project, and specifically in the Tor browser team, at building deterministic reproducible builds. And this, it turns out, is very hard because there's optimizations in compilers where everything changes, or there are timestamps, or there's an entropy seed. So when you hash the binaries, they're different. And even if you disassemble them, they have different optimizations potentially. So we've tried to make it so that they're exactly the same, as much as is possible, and any difference is something which is an understandable, auditable difference. So if you are distributing software that meets this privacy by design standard, it has to be reproducible. And of course, it has to have source code available. So for us to actually be able to do that, we have to go through the entire tool chain. You're back to the classic trusting trust problem, but at least you're no longer trusting us. You're back to trusting the people that provided your compiler. We need to find a way of doing that generically, basically for all software. And the Debian project is working on that right now. So if you are interested in that, I would really encourage you to work on free software for freedom in the Debian project in particular. And there are other projects that are also working on it as well. But I'm a Debian developer, so I'm not going to mention them. At least for now. I need to look to see if they're doing it in a reputable way. I think I have about 10 minutes left for question and answer or something like that. And so I really want to take some questions, and I've already talked too long, but I will say that I really think that the future of the world that we live in is analytics. And one of the things that we will see in the future, and you can mark my words on this, and it is very scary. I'm not telling it to you to scare you. I'm telling it to you because I'm burdened by it, and I'm going to unburden myself a little bit by telling you. One of the things that the NSA wants to do is to build a worldwide system of checkpoints that are integrated with biometrics. So everywhere you go, every train you take, every bus you take, every time you go on an airplane, when you check in with a boarding pass of some kind, you will give an identification card, and you will give this boarding pass, and it will be fed to a real-time system called Traffic Thief. The Traffic Thief system is the same thing that many people's selectors are put into so that an agent can, in real time, be able to know where you're going and what you're doing, popping up an alert. The goal of this is to be able to find any person on the planet anywhere in real time, and to be able to make that into actionable intelligence. This is a thing that we should oppose, and if we are successful, I think that it will be very good. And if we are not successful, I think it is a very scary world indeed, especially because there will be a time when the ID card will be missing and it will just be the boarding pass, and our physical characteristics will in fact be checked against the contents of the boarding pass. This is a real-time, real-life, whole-life surveillance system, and it is a piece of a puzzle that the NSA is working to build. They have not succeeded in this yet, but some of it is happening. Some of it is already here, and there are some places in the world where these systems are online. So every time you give up your biometrics, every time you cross these borders, every time passenger lists are going over the internet, when you have to check in advance, that's actually happening. I'm not actually sure that we can stop this. In fact, I think that probably it's already too late to stop it. But we may be able to stop some of the worst things that it will be used for. There's a really fantastic sci-fi author by the name of Philip K. Dick. Some of you have probably heard of him. He is completely insane, but also circumstantially and just by luck, maybe, he's also correct a lot of the time. He has a book called A Scanner Darkly, and I would really encourage people to read that book. It's better than his other book, A Minority Report, where there's a film called The Minority Report, which is based on his work. And those two books actually talk about a world that we're about to live in, except without mutants. Instead, we have big data. And it's probably the case that by Philip K. Dick writing those books, that the next generation of data analytics was created to build those worlds. So it's kind of funny how that worked out. But it may have also been that he saw it in advance. But I would really encourage you to look at these two books. They're not high philosophy by any means, but they're very instructive, I would say. And to consider that if we want to actually have effective resistance to these kinds of systems, we do have to think beyond technology. This requires social compartmentalization, it requires distributed funding, it requires a lot of things many of the cypherpunks for many years have talked about. And in the book that Julian Assange and I wrote with Jeremy Zimmerman and Annie Miller-Magoon, Cypherpunks, which I would encourage you to pirate and not buy. It's not that good of a book. It's not. It touches on these issues, but we touched on these issues many years before Edward Snowden was in public because these issues were touching on us many years before Edward Snowden felt the need to blow the whistle. So I agree with most of the recommendations that Adi has made, but I would take them further. And I would say, for example, the Dutch resistance that I guess you guys celebrated 3 days ago, that is not a technological victory. That is a social victory. That is a compartmentalized victory. There's also an industrialized side to it, of course. But effective resistance against change of this type requires deep thought and long-term planning. And since most of you are very young, I would encourage all of you, if you are going to go and get jobs at these agencies, to consider what kind of world you want to build. And maybe next you can be the Edward Snowden of the Netherlands or another place. So good luck to you. You have a big fight ahead of you.
Thank you very much. I see already some hands.
I should say as a disclaimer also, once I spoke to an audience of 1,000 students and I told them, if you really, really disagree with what I'm saying, you should never say anything about the talk except that it was terrible. And you should go into those institutions and keep up that facade as long as you can. And then when you realize you're wrong, you know what to do.
Still, I have a question. Thank you also for this talk and showing that we don't need technology to have a good discussion. I have 2 questions actually, and the first would be that you said that we were, as human beings, characterized by our information, and that you were afraid that we were just the quantified self, that it would be the same as us as a person. Is this a reference to Luciano Floridi and his information ethics and philosophy story, where he's arguing that the worldview is changing, and would you encourage a public spreading of such philosophy? That was question 1. And question 2, you mentioned that there are power struggles going on and that maybe technology can equalize them a bit, but do you think power struggles will ever go away? And this is, of course, a question regarding the human condition. What's your take on that?
Oh, well, since it's just a light question, I'll go with maybe, and I'm not sure. I mean, to very concretely address it, I worry about this idea of the data doppelganger. So to remain entropic as a principle requires that you can change your mind. And the data doppelganger sort of suggests that you can't change your mind because you are, in fact, you're basically the sum of all your past decisions, and the next decision, whatever is the most predictable, is the most rational, the most correct one, and obviously that must be your real belief, and if you didn't believe that, you wouldn't have done all the past things, and therefore, if you make a different choice, it's dishonest because the data tells the truth about who you really are, and what your next action is deception. And I really worry about that because I want the freedom to change my mind, because I'm actually wrong all the time, and I want to be able to learn from that and change. But sometimes I'm right, and I also want to be able to learn from that. And in terms of power struggles, of course it's the human condition. And someone recently online wrote something beautiful. They said it is not that capital always has to win or labor always has to win. It is that they always need to be in balance with each other. And they have to win some of the time, each side, and that keeps it in balance. Anything else becomes too imbalanced. And if capital is the only thing that wins and labor is destabilized, lots of things start to fall apart because it's built on this precarious power struggle. But one of the things that I see here is that there is a huge colonization, not only of the internet, but of a whole bunch of other spaces. And technology creates codependencies that we don't yet understand. And so, especially with a lot of automation of systems, like power plants or hospitals, that really, that can have side effects we don't want. And so I think that this is a part of the human condition, But that doesn't mean that because this is a phenomenon of being alive that we should not participate in it and try to make it a little bit better in the ways that we see that we can. Oh God. It's a great honor.
The X-ray project you suggested is fascinating, but it should be extended much further. There aren't that many manufacturers of laptops, and there aren't too many models. But one of the things that the NSA likes to do is to put its embedded secret hardware in peripherals. So they might put it in the keyboard, in the mouse, in almost any device that you connect to your computer. So in particular, they like to take the wire which goes to the monitor, and it has a bulky part with a ferrite core there, and that bulky part is ideal for hiding things. So there are zillions of manufacturers of connectors. How are you going to have a catalog of all the possible X-rays of manufacturers of those add-ons and cabling and wiring? I think it will become almost impossible. Now, one final suggestion. We already have a wonderful cache of things that the NSA had done in the past in the form of the ANT catalog. We have pictures, not X-ray pictures, but visual pictures of how the various implants look like. I think that as another side project for MSc student, he should try to turn those visual images of the tiny devices that the NSA had designed into X-rays and look for them in X-ray images of all kinds of computers and peripherals.
Totally agree. That's a fantastic. I'm humbled by your improvement. Thank you. I agree that it's a really big project, but compared to curing cancer, it doesn't even register as a blip on the budget radar or on the difficulty scale. In fact, it's basically almost a product, but it doesn't have any profit motive, so it needs to be funded in a different way, I think. Solutionism doesn't work here. I think it's a research problem. And I agree that one of the things we should do is take all the known things that are out there that are known to be bad, and we need to have computer vision searching for those things in the sets of data. And that's a very useful thing indeed. I actually am the person that released the ANT catalog with Der Spiegel, so I'm really glad that you have used that information to better this idea. That's very important to me. I think it would be really great if you wanted to lead this project. And I really hope that you'll remember my father's guilt to me, and that I can transfer that to you.
Do I have a mic? Yeah, there we go. So basically today we're talking about a lot about how to use technology, how to get around surveillance. And there are steps we can take. We can use Tor, and for certain surveillance measures, this makes the surveillance less effective. But for other surveillance measures, like you say, for cameras and location tracking through biometrics, this doesn't work anymore. So it seems to me that the only solution would be to stop the surveillance or make the surveillance less pervasive. But my question is, how do we do this? I mean, we have media, we have whistleblowers like Snowden that downloads enormous amounts of documents, but is that enough? And what more can we do?
That's a really easy question. I don't know. What I can see is that if you look at the history of social change as cataloged by Gene Sharp, there are revolutionary movements throughout history that have all these different tactics and all these different strategies. And he's a really great academic, I think, basically cataloging what has worked and hasn't worked and what the stages are of social change. And he's written a number of books, from Dictatorship to Democracy being one of his most famous ones, allegedly used during the Arab Spring. But he goes through this. And what we need to do is add to that, because he is very old and not doing field work anymore. He lives in Boston, and he is not able to do the things that you can do. But we need someone to build a taxonomy of these things to understand it. And so to create that social change, We have to understand the power dynamics, and we need to understand the tactics that people are using. So OTR is one particular thing you can do. It's part of a tactic, but it's not the whole strategy. I definitely think that you're right, that we have to do things to actually stop the surveillance, and that requires change at a different level, right? You can resist inside of the system, but you have to look outside of the system as much as possible to be able to change the whole thing. And I think that's very, very difficult. But for example, there's this great project called CV Dazzle, which is about face makeup that really looks like the 21st century. I always expected from my childhood, where it's, like weird lines and asymmetric hair. And the idea is to confuse computer vision programs that find a face so that they can't do face detection anymore. That's a tactic. It's incredibly difficult to put that much makeup on, and it looks really ridiculous on me. But it probably works for some people, and some people could probably turn it into a fashion thing. There are clothing options which shield you from thermal cameras, which can help you from drones. I think it would make...
You're still talking about ways to circumvent the surveillance or to make them less effective.
I'm suggesting that these things are necessary inside of the surveillance system, but they're not sufficient for getting rid of the surveillance system. But I think once we start to see the different tactics, we'll also start to build our own strategy for changing it. And that's part of what our generation will do, I think, actually. And I think that it's a really hard job in some places, and it's an easy job in other places. I think the surveillance in Iceland, for example, is going to be significantly less difficult to change as a system than it will be in China or the United States or in Europe. But I don't have a revolutionary program to hand out to you. I think actually you have to make that yourself. You have to be that trouble you want to see in the world. Do we have any more?
We're pretty much out of time. If you have a quick one.
Just to add to this, when you say, we have the media and we have Snowden, as I tried to point out before, that may not be the case for that much longer. And I think what's important for us is maybe to stop purely looking at technology. Maybe it's time we just all go to The Hague and protest there and start there. I mean, perhaps that could be something, and then from there, move on and see what else can be done. But I think the lack of sort of physical presence of demonstrations. I mean, Germany had some, but across Europe there's been a lot of reporting about Snowden, but there has been nobody that actually went out to the street and said, this needs to end, or our government needs to do something about this.
Yeah, I mean, I would also follow up by saying, I live in Europe, and I have for the last 2 years, and in like about a week or a month, depending on how you count it, I will have lived in Europe for 2 years, basically in exile because of the WikiLeaks investigation against Julian Assange and myself, because the work we've done as investigative journalists that helped Adi to give his talk has made it so that it was unsafe for me to remain in my own country where I'm a citizen, where I feel as I have more rights as essentially an immigrant in Europe, which is speaking of the Jewish guilt of my parents, boy is that an irony I could have never predicted. Seriously. But that is a social problem and a political problem at its core. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to, I think, hopefully study math with Dan and Tanya, because I think that that is an important part of it. We need more cryptographers in the world in an information society. We really do. We also need Snowdens of the world and Chelsea Mannings of the world, and we need people that do all things. I mean, to build an alternative path to the one that we're on right now requires us to actually look at all of the things that alternate has, what it needs to run, and we need to build it, and we have to run it. And it takes effort. And so I think that if you're here at the university, you should, and you have this opportunity, you should use that privilege to study and then apply that in useful ways. I mean, there's also lots of good humanitarian work to do which improves people's lives, and there's a lot of it. You could build a water filter, and you'll probably save a lot of people's lives, and that is also a good thing to do. Instead of working at Google and working on ad tracking, or at Palantir to work on, Muslim tracking, right? History will not be kind to those companies, for sure, and we shouldn't be kind to them either right now. But you can do something like that. So that's what I would encourage. And that doesn't have to be a whole solution, but individual solutions actually produce, I think, some very good outcomes. So I hope that inspires at least you, guy with the great hair.
Okay, well, thank you for the inspiring talk. And we now have a coffee break till 3:30. Please be back here at 3:30. And please join me in thanking Jake again.